Hello and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guest is Cliff Beach. Hey, Cliff, how are you doing?
Hi, Matty. How are you? Nice to see you again.
I'm doing great. It's lovely to see you too. To give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, author and musician Cliff Beach is the host of the Deeper Grooves podcast and Deeper Grooves on 88.5 FM. He's the winner of the John Lennon Songwriting Contest Grand Prize, 2 World Songwriting Awards, 4 Global Music Awards, and a California Music Video and Film Award, and has been nominated for many more. His music has been featured on the CW, HBO Max, and in a BMW spot, and his single Confident was featured on Spotify, All Funked Up, and Funk Drive playlists. And he is also the author of the book Side Hustle and Flow. And Cliff spoke to me about that book in one of the installments of my What I Learned video series on the Indy Author YouTube channel, where I ask authors, what did you learn from your latest book that you'd like to share with your fellow authors? And what did you learn from your latest book that you'd like to share with your fellow readers? And I enjoyed what Cliff had to say so much about how he has applied his experience as a musician to writing that I invited him on the podcast to talk about what writers can learn from the music world. So again, welcome back, Cliff.
Thank you so much for having me again. I'm excited to chat about this topic.
Yeah. So I thought that a good way to dive into this topic would be to ask you, since you were a musician before you were an author, what was it creatively that drove you to expand your creative content from music to writing?
That's a very good question, Matty. So I've always just on my bucket list wanted to write. I love books. I was a voracious reader as a child. And I feel like if you were to map the brain, how music lights up so many pieces of the brain that we know on both sides, I think reading and writing also helps to light up those things. So I feel being inspired comes from a lot of different mediums outside of music. So you can get inspired by books. You can get inspired by film. So I always wanted to be able to do that. I also, when I was researching the book, read Robert McKee's story, and he explains that different mediums allow you to be able to tell different types of stories. So the type of story that I wanted to tell about my life and music and work ethic and mindset linked itself to a book, an audiobook, Side Hustle and Flow, much better than a song would, even though I've written songs on that subject matter as well, including an upcoming song called The Work on my newest album, Beach Please. So for me, I wanted to write the book and I wanted to learn about the process. So song, for sure, like studying music my whole life and then going to conservatory, there is a process. There is a formula. There are building blocks. The same way books are no different. It's like to be able to structure a sentence and to have a flow, all of those things put in place. And so in music, we have what's called a pre-production phase. You'll sit down and you figure, okay, what songs do we want to do? How do we want to demo these? What instrumentation do we want to have? That kind of thing, arrangement. And the same way with the book, I had a process of doing the outlining process, taking classes on that. It really helped me to be able to structure the book fully. So I think mostly the similarity between the two are having the idea of preparation. For sure, the preparation always is important. I believe, I can't remember if it was Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, but he said, like, if I was chopping down a tree, I would spend most of my time sharpening the axe. Something to that effect. Where like the preparation is so important to be able to get it done. Because I had tried to write a book previously in 2014 called The Art of Awesome. Then eventually that became this book, which was originally titled From Full to Fulfilled, but eventually became Side Hustle and Flow. I think having life experience is important. So that led me, years later from 2014 to 2020 to actually write the book to start to finish. And then I just feel all of those things, your first album, your first book are like a combination of all your experiences. So I think, again, just enjoy the process and the journey. That's the most, I think, fulfilling part. And then getting it out there eventually so that people can hear it or see it is very rewarding as well.
What are the time frame differences and similarities? So it sounds like you worked on that first book for a long time. I imagine, especially because you've won so many awards with your work, you must be producing musical work more quickly. How would you compare the time frame that you invest in each sort of piece of content in those two areas?
Yeah, it really depends. So if you're looking at making one song, a song can take a few hours or a few days or a few years, depending on how long you want to spend to it. I think in terms of advice for people that I talk to with songwriting, particularly, or with book writing, is that you don't want to go into it thinking, I want to make my opus, essentially. You'll write again, you'll produce again, you'll make another song or something like that. So really just try to get as much of the idea that you have out there I think in the shortest amount of time possible. So for me, like my whole life was accelerating. I went to school and I finished at 16 and then I graduated conservatory at 19. I'm always trying to figure out how do I get something done faster, because the longer it takes for me, the more I'll probably not finish if it just takes too long. So I think you just have to know yourself. Some people I think are also paralyzed by perfection. Like there are always, every recording that I've done, something that I was like, I wish that was different, but it is what it is. We need to get it out there. There's always like constraints that you're working in life. And I don't think there really is any perfect situations or perfect pieces of music or perfect productions or perfect books. I think you just have to get it to the best possible quality that you can for that time. Knowing that, I'm sure there are writers who are like, oh my God, don't even look at my first book because I learned so much 10 books later. And I feel the same way about music. There's things where I was like, oh, that's why that was, okay, not good. Instead of trying to go back and rehash the past, I was like, let's learn this and put this into the next song. Let's put this into the next album. So we're always trying to write or progress forward. There is no going back. And I think there's another quote that says like, burn your book, burn all the books, and you can't go back. You can only go forward. Because you really can, people think in life, like you go through different things and they're like, oh, I'll get over it. You never really get over anything. You go through. The only way is through. And that works for music and writing.
Have you ever withdrawn an early work that you decided wasn't working? Like you look back, it was an early one, you thought, no, I don't want that anymore. Like, is that even a possibility in the music world to withdraw it if you want to?
Yes, you can. You can actually go back to something you released and go back to streaming service and say, we want to pull that down, and you can re-release it differently ahead of time. There's also in the music world what we call hard drive records, which essentially they just live on your hard drive. They never get out. They're just demos. Prince had them, or Michael Jackson had them. A bunch of artists have them because they know this is not up to snuff or this is not up to the level. But the good thing about that is that as an artist, you want to constantly be producing because you may make 10 songs to get to that hit. Pharrell, who I love, Pharrell Williams, he did the music for Despicable Me, and he wrote the song Happy. Now, Happy, people are like, oh, that's an amazing song. But that was actually the 14th song he released. He gave to them to be able to decide on what they wanted to use for the movie. And he's, a top hit making, at one time had like 40% of all the top hits done by him in some capacity. So you have to remember that. You look at someone like a Stevie Wonder who writes amazing hits. He wrote Tell Me Something Good for Chaka Khan and Rufus. And that whole song, if you listen to the lyrics, tell me something good, tell me that you like it. That's Stevie Wonder explaining how he had written all these other songs that they didn't like and eventually got to the one that they did. So I think you have to continually write through the process. I think everyone is going to put a lot of bad out there to eventually get to the good. That's why you write and then you edit and you edit and you edit until it gets there. If you don't, for the most part, come to a lump of coal that's just a diamond ready to go. It's a process of stripping away the stuff that isn't working to eventually figure that out. And you figure that out for all media, for scripts and for TV and for film and for music and for art. There's always ways to continue to improve. But if you don't start, if you don't create those things, that maybe doesn't get out into the world, but those building blocks and pieces of that you can pull from later, or you learn what not to do. And this idea of originally Malcolm Gladwell said it would be 10,000 hours to be able to become proficient at something. And then later said, it's not actually 10,000 hours, it's Thomas Edison, 10,000 experiments to be able to get to that. And then when you look at Edison, you're like, it was 10,000 experiments times the 23 other inventors at the time that he learned from, who also had their 10,000 experiments. So it's like, that's hundreds of thousands of experiments, knowledge to be able to eventually produce a working light bulb or a working book or a working song or a working album. So just know that everybody is in that journey and part of the process. You look at people who have written tons of books, like a Stephen King, they're always still going through the process and they're always still learning. I think the ultimate thing, as I think about hustle and I think about work ethic, I think the people that I admire the most, or no matter at what age they decide to start or whatever age they're still in the trenches and doing it, that they have a hunger. I think hunger, which comes out of necessity, helps you to create. That's how things like Airbnb and Uber became. That's how certain movies like Rocky became. Sylvester Stallone is like selling his dog at the liquor store, because he's desperate. And Rice is film about an underdog and then he's like, and I have to be in it because I am Rocky. I am the person who has been beat up, bludgeoned by circumstance, as Maya Angelou would say. And so eventually he buys the dog back, he sells it at a crazy price and has to give this guy who he sold it to a part in Rocky to be able to get his dog back. But I love that story because he wrote this in a weekend and he stuck to his beliefs. They wanted to buy it for an insane amount of money. He's like, no, I will only sell it if I get to be in it. And that launched his career. And he won an Oscar for the writing of it. And so, and this person who lived this life, who had, some type of deformity and something they had to get over. Everybody has to get over something. And music just happens to be a great place in my mind for those types of people, because you want to hear about people's struggle. That's why we love Rag to Riches, because people want something to inspire and aspire to. If you were going to watch a movie where everything was great in the beginning and everything's great in the middle and great at the end, no one cares. That's very self-congratulatory, and it irritates people because they're like, and this person's life is perfect and I can't aspire to that. Really, I would tell people like a movie that has no problem is a problem, and a book that has no problem. The problem. People need to follow this classic hero's journey. You want to see like, okay, very quickly get to the problem, and then by the end, we get to the resolution. One of my favorite books growing up as a kid was a series called The Chronicles of Friday. But essentially, in this one book, Tara and the Wanderer, which is I think the fourth book of the series, is as I was growing up, it's about a boy and he's growing up and he goes through all these changes and he's looking for this mirror. And at the end, they find out it's in his cave, it's a reflecting pool, and he looks down and he sees a reflection of himself, and he's like, oh, I have these lines on my face, like Steven Tyler and Dream On. He's like, these lines on my face are getting clearer. You can see the age and the process. The whole point of this book is that there is no magic mirror. He was changed by the things he went through and the experience. And so I think music allows you to be able to tell those stories in that way and have that transference of feeling with an audience to be able to resonate there. And books do it all the time. When I read Harry Potter, it was like seeing that whole series of books and just understanding that for all types of creative art, we are paid and revered because we were able to pull ideas out of our brain and put them in front of our face. Someone else can now share in the experience of that idea, which I think is very exciting. And I think that's what makes us different as human beings, that we have that creative gift to be able to take all of our experiences, the good, the bad, the ugly, whatever, and turn that into something wonderful and beautiful, something that can leave a legacy and be shared for many years to come. And I think music is the way that I was able to do that. But now I'm excited to be able to have books to be able to expand on that story too.
So I wanted to go back to something you had mentioned earlier, and that was the idea of always trying to find ways to achieve more quickly. You talked about when you graduated from school, when you graduated from conservatory. So is that need for speed, what is that driven by? Is it driven by financial considerations or creative considerations or market considerations?
No, that is a very good question. Well, from a marketing and business perspective, I can tell you this. Time, cost, and quality are related. If anyone is a nerd like me and wants to look it up, there's actually a thing called the time, cost, quality train. Definitely take a look. It just shows you that if you want to play fast, it will probably end up costing you more. So that's why, FedEx and expediting packages cost more than snail mail. There's a reason for that. So you have to realize that there's that. Now, from a mental and mindset and just productivity, I think having that fire underneath you and sense of urgency, that's why a lot of people can do well with procrastination at the 11th hour. Some people just can burn that candle that way. I think there really is no right or wrong way. Some people run a marathon, some people walk a marathon. I think all are fine. I think the main thing is just setting something that you can realistically do. I think if you try to overwhelm yourself, it makes people burn out in a lot of different ways. Like not everybody is going to be able to accelerate their life or accelerate the process. And I think as you're able to learn a process, that helps you to be able to accelerate. Like I've had albums that have taken me 2 years, and now I have an album that take me 6 months. I think you learn ways to hack in, but there's some reasons why you don't do that. And also, again, time, cost, and quality. The quality is a factor of the time as well. And that's the quality of who you become. Again, like in that story of Tara and the Wanderer, who he became. If he sped that up, he may have only been half of that. But at the same time, you have people like Tony Robbins who are like, well, I want to become the best. So I'm going to give 10 times the speeches a person would give. So it connects faster. And there's a ebb and flow to life of when you would do that. But when I say that, you think of wine, and I don't drink anymore, but when I did, you think of wine, I lived in France, they have the Beaujolais Nouveau. That's a wine that doesn't age hardly at all. I mean, you have wine that are like King's vinegar that ages way too long, are super expensive. So in that, again, it's part of the process. It's like if you want a wine that ages well over time, then that's going to take time. And thus, then the quality will be enhanced. So it just depends. I think that's why sometimes people are like, wow, this person's first book or first album is like their masterpiece and the rest of them pale in comparison. Well, sometimes that happens, especially in music, because it's like, well, you've disseminated a lifetime in that first outing. And some people are like, oh, we hit that out of the box. Because if I've been working on this 20 years and put something out, then that's going to have a lot of time horizon built into a condensed version. But then maybe the next album, like, okay, you have to follow up on that in a year. Well, it's like, well, I can't make a year the same as the 20 years before. So that's why people usually have what's called like the second album slump. It doesn't happen to all artists, but it can. But I think ultimately you just want to do whatever is true to yourself. If you're a person that's built for comfort, not for speed, and walking is for your speed than running, that's fine. Again, the main thing is that you start and you finish. Because if that idea remains half done, then it's only a work that's half begun. And we're not going to be able to really be able to enjoy that until it's finished, unless it's something that's meant to be done in pieces or in smaller chunks. And then there are people that are working on stuff like that. You look at books like Chicken Soup for the Soul. You can read a page a day or whatever it is. And that's an amazing story. You look at someone like Jack Canfield and Mark Victor Hansen and how they went to all these publishers and nobody wanted the book. And it's really cool because it's a book that's written in collaboration with a bunch of different people. And I love collaborations when it comes to poetry and other stuff. I love compilations when it comes to genres of music and albums and stuff too. So I think there really is no right or wrong way. You have to do what's right for you. But I think at the same time, realize that you can be your own worst enemy. So if you're procrastinating, it's like sometimes you need to speed up. And if you're going too fast, that you're bulldozing through middle winds and things like that, then maybe you need to slow your pace down. So I think maybe it's a Goldilocks situation where eventually the third time is a charm and
that
you're
could
like,
be your next book, the Goldilocks book.
I think so, except for me, it bothered me because I'm like, she broke into people's house, right?
Yeah. Some fairy tales don't really tell the morals that maybe they were originally intended to convey. But I did want to ask another question about another, I think, difference between music and writing, but I'd be curious for your opinion on this. And that is that as you were talking about different authors and different musicians' experiences, I feel like with musicians, people will say, oh, there was the such and such album, and that was my favorite. And then there was the such and such album, and I didn't like that so much. Then the next album came along, and I really liked that. Whereas, there's sort of eras in a musician's career that the people who follow them acknowledge, and some of those eras they like better, and some of them they like less well. But I don't really see people saying, oh, and then they put out their third album, and I just thought nuts to that, and I never listened to anything they did again. Whereas I do think that writers, it's more like people are expecting just a continual upward trajectory against whatever their personal criteria for excellence is. And that if the writer fails to deliver on that upward trajectory, that they risk losing that follower entirely. Does that ring true for you? Or are you seeing a different perspective, having experiences in both those worlds?
Yeah, I do see some similarities there. And I think in music, it does happen where there is what I would call like a snobbery in terms of you listen to a person's first album and you really love it and they have the second slump and then by the third album, like people have tuned out. So there's fickleness in fandom, I think, on both sides. I think on the writing side, people do believe that as you do books, they will get better. But again, as I had talked to really about having that hunger, I think what tends to happen is there are artists who begin to rest on their laurels. In a sense, their content, they start to phone it in after a certain amount of time because they've built an audience where they're like, I can fart on a microphone at this point and they would clap. And so I think writing can become the same way at sometimes. You look at an artist like, for me, Lenny Kravitz. I love his first 5 albums, 5 being pinnacle, I think. And then after that, I don't love any of his other music because I believe he became a sex symbol and a model and a beautiful person, even at 50 and vegan. I mean, he looked great, but his content, I think he just lost certain perspective. And I think that happens for a lot of artists. Look at like Madonna, she constantly was chameleon and changing. And now I think they have the ability of becoming a caricature of their former self. And that happens in writing too. So again, I think it's the hunger and the drive that I think keeps you motivated. So you look at someone like a Tony Bennett, who's making albums with Lady Gaga at 95. That's someone that I would aspire to because it's like they're constantly pushing, how can I remain relevant while still being true to themselves? And I think that's a hard balance because I think sometimes you just start to pander or you have so many people that are telling you conflicting information because, you know, your record label is going to tell you something different from your fans. It's going to tell you something different from your true kind of friends and believers that are behind you. And then yourself. And then you look at someone like a Prince who had some amazing albums and then some albums that were like really just for him. And you see writing like that too. There's some people who like, okay, they wrote this for them. And this may not be a bestseller because it's not going to be for everybody. It's so esoteric or so specific. You see that a lot when I was working on my book. It's half hybrid of memoir and self-help. And so in the memoir world, there's definitely a lot of people who are like, I just want to get my life down on paper. But that necessarily isn't entertaining or something for someone to aspire to. And that's really just like a journal, essentially, that you publish. And that's fine. But in terms of like the commerce in the book, you never want to let what you want to say get in the way of what your audience needs to hear. Like if you're writing it for an audience, and that's marketing, that has a demographic, that has what else are we reading? Where are you competing against within that space in terms of timing and things like that? And that happens in the music world too. So I think it's really hard. Especially as you become popular, to stay true to yourself. I actually heard through another friend who has a podcast and works for a group, IK Multimedia, he was going to interview Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis coming up. And what he told me is that this group, who has produced tons of hits for Janet Jackson, they were like, well, how do you stay so hot for so long? And they said, we never wanted to be hot. We want to be a slow boil. And I've heard that in certain artists like Stevie Wonder and stuff. Like, if you want to be a one-hit wonder, you go real hot and it's over. But it's like, if you want to have a consistent career as an artist, as a writer, then that slow boil, making things that are consistent and good. Maybe they're not great, but they're good to the audience. And you see this a lot in certain types of fiction and romance and mystery. It's like they know they're going to make series and want to tell these stories over time. So it's like the slow boil sometimes is the way to go. And again, Goldilocks. Not too hot, not too cold. That's right.
Just a quick break from the interview. Are you getting value from the podcast? Please consider supporting it and all the work I do at the Indy Author by becoming a patron. To pledge a monthly contribution, go to patreon.com/the Indy Author, or to make an occasional contribution, perhaps to indicate the value that a specific episode or resource provided to you on your creative voyage, scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. And now, back to the interview. Well, that makes me think of, I'm not sure this is a question about creativity or business, but I think a difference between the book world and the music world is that if you love a musician and they've put out 5 albums, I'm talking in terms of albums because my mindset is in the 80s, but they put out their content. Let's say they've written 100 songs and there are 10 of them you love. And so you might listen to each of those 10 1,000 times over your life. Nobody listens to a song and says, that was really great. I'm really glad I listened to that, and never go back to it. You listen to it over and over again. As opposed to a book. I mean, sometimes people go back and reread books that they've loved, but rarely to the same extent that people go back and listen to music that they've really loved. So it means that someone who has written 100 songs and there's 10 that a certain fan loves, they're still engaging with that fan every time they're listening to one of those 10 songs. Whereas a writer, I'm kind of thinking back now to that idea that once you've fallen off their trajectory that your reader has expected for you, you're kind of lost. There again, does that ring true for you? And do you feel like that difference between a musician whose work is enjoyed over and over again by their fans and an author whose work is usually enjoyed just once, are there lessons to be learned there, either from a creative or a business point of view?
Yeah, and I think it depends on the genre and I think on the type of book. So There's a few different ways to answer that question, but in terms of music, like you look at an album like Thriller, an album that sold a lot of most copies of any single artist, 40 million plus copies. But then there are certain songs that will stick out more than others. The ones that have music videos, the ones that were singles, etc. Other than ones that are kind of like B tracks or album fillers. In the same way, look at someone like Tim Ferriss, who wrote Tools for Titans. And in that beginning of that book, he says, you can read this whole book. You cannot read this whole book. You can read one chapter, look at the content and see what resonates with you. So in nonfiction, I think there are ways for people to come back to your book over time, because as you're at different stages of life, some of that information may be more or less relevant to you. In terms of books that are a little bit more on the fiction side and telling one story arc, I don't know if necessarily you would go back and read a certain book, but if the series continues, there are people who are loyal. You look at a Harry Potter as it moved into Fantastic Beasts, into stage plays, people still want to be a part of that universe. Star Wars has branched off into a million different aspects, and including books. So I think, yeah, in that way, I think people will continue with a series within a book. I don't know necessarily they will go back and read it, but I think that's the beauty of it. Again, the audience gets to decide how they want to do it. Now, could authors and series and characters branch off and dovetail into shorter form content that people could come back to and read faster, as a serial? A lot of books were released like that in pieces. And I think there are some stuff, there's fan fiction that's coming up and people writing offshoots and stuff like that. So I think there are ways in there. But again, I think that's why Robert McKee's book story is so interesting, is because it explains in certain mediums how people will consume the content. People will read a book over time and they may not read the book again, but it may stick with them, in a different way than other mediums. So you have to look at it that way. It's like, it's a little bit different from music, like some artists want you to consume their whole album and some people will only listen to like a few songs. So sometimes you're not able to get someone who will commit to a full album. I think different mediums of how it's created. In the record world, you have vinyl records and CDs, and then you have Spotify and streaming and stuff. So I think some of the streaming services, digital, lends itself to some of those single pieces, whereas a CD or a vinyl record, you may actually have people who commit to a full album and people who want to know more about the artist and more about the songs and the process. There are commentary records and stuff that come out too. So it just depends. I think you just want to have as much diversity within your portfolio and diversity in the methods of how you get it out to people. There are people in the nonfiction world that are pushing out chapters at a time in podcast form so people can digest it in short form media. So I think we're going to see a lot of changes in the digital space, especially with like YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels. People are really getting 15 seconds and 60 seconds to really capture people's attention and giving them content daily, which can be exciting too. So I think maybe eventually there'll be short form songs that are only 15 seconds. You have to realize that people have different learning styles. So people learn through audio. Some people learn visually. Some people learn through written word. So for me, it was very important to have, if I was only going to write one book, have it in all the media, hardcover, softcover, Kindle, ebook, and audiobook, because you have to be able to catch people where they live. You're not going to be able to catch, I'm not going to convince someone who would never listen to audiobook to go listen to audio. If they're a bibliophile, they want to read a book. And if they want to read a physical book, I'm not going to capture someone in the digital version if they're like, I only read physical books. So that's why I like the print on demand. So people who are self-publishing are able to have that if needed. But again, yeah, you want the content in the same way. You want to have a vinyl record, you want to have CD, you want to have streaming, you want to have music video. So there's going to be different people who are going to want different things from you. Not because of you as the artist, but because that's how they absorb information. If you are creating something that lends itself to a certain media, like let's say you're creating a graphic novel, if you want to read that like a comic, a hard physical book is going to be the way to do that, to really have the level of imagery and visualization. Then you're going to do that if that's your demographic. But sometimes it's up to the author. Like some people are like, I have to have this in hardcover that's going to signify something for me. And now it's for me a goal because I knew physical book had not only a nostalgia, but they had a respect within the literary community. In the same way, sometimes you get a respect going from a traditional publisher to self-publishing. But I think the correlation with music and writing when it comes to self-publishing or traditional publishing is at the end of the day, get it out there. I think definitely shop it around. But at the end of the day, if self-publishing is the only way to go, which I've done many times for my music, then you want to do that because you don't want to necessarily always be in a situation where you're waiting for someone else to say, yeah, to greenlight your idea. Because again, there's a timing to that. And I think there's a motivation and energy that comes from to getting out there. And so, like I said, I think you should definitely take the time, but then you're supposed to always shop it around. Like I shop albums around to put it out. And I've had people who are like, yes, we'll do that. And if it works out, great. And if it doesn't, then I always have the self-publishing route to go. And I think there's advantages to both. Again, with risk and reward, obviously, there's a lot of risk to self-publishing, but you can, on the back end, you have no one else to beholden to, but you gain all the money and you have the control over advertising and things like that. So I think in music and writing, you have that. I think the hardest thing as a creative person on both sides is sometimes being the creative person can be a bad thing because there's the art and the commerce. And not all creative people are business people. So when I was going to music school, nobody tells you that you are a business, that you are a solopreneur, and that you have to know about marketing and demographics and how to get something out there and how to build a presence and a tribe and social media and an email list and all the things. It's like they don't tell you. What if they tell you? They don't tell you. If you want to be successful, you have to do that. Even if you have a manager, even if you have a label, even if you have something, there's still something that you have to do. No one is going to hustle harder for your dream than you. And I've paid many people for PR and for radio and for all kinds of different things. And I always have to be the person following up on them, giving them new ideas. Did you look at this? Did you do that? Did you do this? They're just not going to do that because it's not their dream. It's your dream. And it's up to you to be able to nurture that dream and to see that grow and to go into fruition. And it's hard and it's difficult. And I think you have to be prepared that there's going to be difficulties and there's going to be delays and there's going to be dead ends to that dream. And it's not for the faint of heart. And that's why a lot of books don't get done. And that's why a lot of the albums don't. I think also there's crowdfunding, which we didn't talk about, but in both worlds, I think people who were like, hey, I'm releasing this content. Do you want to be a part of that? I think you should immobilize. I haven't done it just because I've worked with investors in the past. I didn't like the process for myself, but when I've been a part of projects that I've crowdfunded to Kickstarter, GoFundMe and stuff like that. And I think it's nice for books and for music to have that as an avenue because it does mitigate some of that risk. But at the same time, you already are releasing something knowing that there's a certain amount of people who are going to have it and want to have it. They're giving you money to be able to get that dream funded. And the most important part is there are makers and then there are people who can only appreciate what is made. And so you need both sides. And so if you're the maker side and maybe not the best on the business side, let other people who wish they could do that making part support you. They want to root for you because they're like, I wish I could do it. I can't. The next best thing is to invest in somebody else. And that might build some relationships where when you do the next one and the next one, they tell their friends and more people become to support you. The whole point is that you want to build this mini tribe. Even if you have 50 people, 100 people who are excited to see your content, you can build upon that. It doesn't have to be millions of people at once. That's not going to be probably the case for most people, but can 100 people tell 2 other people and that 2-3x your community? Yes. And I think, with Facebook groups and other stuff, getting out there with other authors, getting out there with other musicians, collaborating, networking. I'm reminded of, I think, Stephen Covey, but basically you want to be interested, not interesting, which is hard for an artist. But it's like the more you absorb this thing that there are other people doing cool things and supporting that. There was a whole thing where they talked about how did Taylor Swift become so big? And she would bring people like Kobe Bryant on stage and random people. And she'd be like, look at how great this person. And they would reciprocate and then and post about it. Not because she was doing it to get posted, but there is this symbiotic relationship of promoting other people. That's why I love as an author or musician, like, hey, this is songs that I listen to. You should look at this artist. Or like, here's books that I've read that inspire me. You should go read this person. I don't get anything from that. But it shows that I'm a human being and part of an ecosystem. that has enough love and support for everybody. And if you help enough people, then you can eventually get what you want. But if you're thinking about only what I want and very intrinsic, very me, then that's not going to get you nearly the reach that you could have had if you're like, oh, look at what you did. So with Side Hustle and Flow, I wanted to write my story up until the point it impacted your story so that people could tell me their story of overcoming, because that's impactful and powerful. No one's going to read my book and go do what I did. It's impossible. You can't be me, and for better or worse. And you can't redo those things because they've already happened. You can't trap lightning in a bottle. And so I think as people realize that, the more people that you pull into your story and show how we're connected, that's what makes a book great. When you're like, oh my God, that spoke to me because I can see myself in this protagonist. I can see myself in this character. I can see myself in this journey and these little nuggets of truth or wisdom that are coming along the way on this yellow brick road leading me up to this wizard. I'm able to understand, oh my God, I had all these pieces inside me the whole time. I had the shoes. I had the heart. I had the courage. I had it. I just wasn't aware. Thank you so much to tell me this story. So it reminded me that I should be aware of it.
Well, I think now we've hit the Goldilocks and the Wizard of Oz. So I think the Ruby Slippers is a great visual to end on. So Cliff, thank you so much. I was so pleased to bring you back for another conversation. Please let the listeners and viewers know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Oh, thank you so much, Matty, for having me again. I love the conversation. You can find me on social media at Cliff Beach Music. You can find the book Side Hustle and Flow out on Amazon and Audible, Kindle, and sidehustleandflow.net.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.